identified in first government two problems for this debate. First of all, when we want to change environmental issues, it doesn't stop at borders. So it's a worldwide problem, and if a society chooses to do so and change environmental issues, it's part of the political agenda that it's affecting not its own country, but other countries in itself, because otherwise we can't change anything with environmental problems. The second problem is when a society decides to have a specific environmental politics. The problem is when multinational companies doesn't accept all standards of environment in all steps of production. It is anti-democratic because the will of the people doesn't get involved and live in action because we have in our own country maybe standards we want to have, but in other countries in the production it won't affect, and so the problems can't be changed in itself in a complete way. So we believe that multinational companies conduct any business in Western states. These nations should enforce their environmental standards at all stages of production. We believe that it's likely like the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act in the USA, so the nation should lawsuit these companies if they don't implement all standards of environmental in all parts of the production. I want to talk about the problems directly in other countries. I want to talk about how we can change environmental problems. I want to talk about the consequences in other countries and the moral high ground of Western states. And last but not least, I want to talk about democracy. Okay, first of all, what we have a big problem in modern Western states. For example, in the high-tech industry, we need a lot of rare metal and rare soil to do the production. So the end production are mostly time in the first world states, like in the Western states, where the phones, etc. is putting together. But in the production type, like how to get the rare soils and rare metals to do so, this type of production is done in other countries, and there are other standards implemented. And the problem we believe in is when a country and a nation decided to change environmental issues, it's got the whole system is like kind of corrupted because the companies could just change their production to another country or part of the production and leave the problem to another country. We believe, first of all, this is problematic because our politics and our policy, our political agenda can't be really affected in all stages of production, so the political agenda is not very effective. And secondly, the problem is that our problems we provide in production, we give in to other countries who have maybe not the power or not the political power in their own countries to have these standards. So we believe it's a moral issue for this country to lawsuit or to enforce the companies to change the standards of production because the political agenda can so be fulfilled. The second problem, the second thing we believe there, that the consequences in our production, we didn't getting hurt directly by the production we do. If we have environmental standards in our production, in our own country with multinational companies, the problems getting from our country to other countries. For example, when we have you have low environmental standards in the energy efficiency, for example, the problems getting to other countries. For example, when you have the pollution, when it's about pollution, when it's about getting toxic in the seas, etc. We don't see the problems directly because we don't feel it, we don't know what happens, but other countries getting infected and they have not the power in their own countries to have the same standards as we do. So we believe that especially Western states who believe this environmental issues are important should have their moral duty to change that. Especially because environment don't stop at borders. That's a very important point. If you want to change something in the environment, it's important that all countries are included. When we just implement standards in our own country, in our production, we have the problem that the consequences of our production still have environmental issues in the world, like the pollution in the sky or like the toxic in the seas. So we don't see a really change in the world, between or we don't see a real change in the production at all, because the countries would go to other countries where it's like cheaper or where standards are lower, just to easier fulfill the production, and we see this as a problem. The third point is democracy. We believe that political agendas must be effective in a nation. When a nation and a society decides that environmental standards are very important for themselves, it's important that the political agenda is effective. We believe that, or we think that the problem is that we might say the environment is very important, but we don't see the issues companies implement in other countries, like the pollution or like toxic and disease. And we believe if society decides to have a specific political agenda, especially with the environment, it's important that these companies who do any business in our own country have to implement all environmental standards in all parts of the production, because the will of the people are getting really hurt. In the status quo, we have the problem that we want to make the companies to have these standards, but the companies have many possibilities to just not to do the standards because they put a production in other states. And we believe that it's a democratic choice and it's a democratic will what can be fulfilled with this model, with this part of this debate. So to sum up all, we believe environmental issues don't stop at borders. We believe we have to do this to fulfill environmental standards at all, to fulfill the democratic will, and to be yes, honest with ourselves. Thank you.
We'd like to thank the Prime Minister and call upon the Leader of Opposition, Janet.
Yeah.
Yeah, sorry.
No problem. No offense taken. Ladies and gentlemen of the House, let's not kid ourselves. We are here once again repeating the history of the world as we have known it for the past 400 years. What we are doing here is, in the words of the Prime Minister, putting the advantage of our people and giving more power to our people than we are giving to anyone else. Because what is this? We are talking about imposing multinational corporations that are very important players in developing countries, in bringing them jobs, in bringing them investments, enforcing these multinational corporations to adopt our standards over the standards of the countries where they are actually implemented and economically working. Now, these countries are sovereign. These are countries that are allowed to have their own laws, that are allowed to have their own standards, and if we want to adopt new standards, better standards, or we think that our standards are better than theirs and we would like them to adopt those standards, then what we need to do, there are rules, there are international conferences and organizations where we have forums where we discuss and implement and set new standards. That is the way diplomacy works, and we have to respect the other countries as sovereign and give their peoples also the exact same amount of democratic value that we give our people. If for us, we can enforce environmental standards because we have a roof, we have food, we have everything. If for the Chinese people, oh, by the way, very nice words on the opening side. What was it exactly? They do not have the power to enforce. I would really like you to go tell China that they don't have the power to enforce their own standards, or Russia. Okay, sir.
You say that these countries are sovereign, but surely the multinationals are also sovereign. So just as a country has the option to reject these economic standards, the multinational has the option to reject doing deals with the West and following their environmental standards. Do they not?
The corporations are right now free, but they are outside of the democratic game, and we are. That is a completely different debate. If we want to control the multinational corporations, what we are trying here is to enforce our standards that are important to our populations in other countries. What we are actually taking is taking the competitive edge that the third world, that the developing world has right now, which is playing with lower standards, playing with the lower wages, in order to attract foreign capital and in order to attract foreign investment, that we are taking that away from them by forcing the corporations to adopt these standards on all levels. So either they are leaving, no sir. So either they will be leaving the other countries, or the other countries will have to go down to our will, to our standards that are not necessarily in their own advantage. In any case, this is not a good thing for either the countries or the multinational corporations. We are killing the business of the corporations. We are killing the countries, because if they do not adapt their standards, what will happen? The corporations will leave, because they cannot produce in those countries that are not producing, that do not have the high enough standards. They leave, they create a crisis. People will lose their jobs. We will eventually, on a very short term, have a huge crisis. We will have heightened immigration to our countries. We will have heightened problems on every scale. On the second level, what we are also losing is that right now there is something that we do have a competitive advantage in, and a very big one, that is in clean technologies that are generally less competitive on huge markets, and they are staying in our Western countries. What will happen in the second phase after this crisis happens, and the economies of the developing world are adapted to the new standards? What will eventually happen is that they will still be cheaper on the wage area. So what we have is that the new clean technology will be cheaper to produce elsewhere, and we are losing on that, because there won't be jobs in those industries that are actually staying here because of the standards. We will lose them. Yes, sir.
Sir, do you not acknowledge that developing countries' advantage lies not in ruining the world's environment, but surely in the relative spending parity of their wages and in the relative foreign exchange market, meaning the production of the labour is cheaper there?
They have several areas where they have edges, and one of them is also by playing on the environmental standards. It is a reality that you cannot. The reason why we have so cheap products, technology products here, etc., is because the production methods are not according to the standards that we set here in our countries. Now, by forcing these standards over there, we are either getting the companies to move back from there, like I explained several times, or we are So like I said, the corporations are actually also standing in a situation where they might lose a lot, because they have to transform the way they are producing, and they have to go to much more expensive technologies in order to produce according to standards. By this, we are setting these corporations in a situation where they might go bankrupt, which is bad for everybody. It is bad for us. It is also bad for the people they employ overseas.
On that point?
Yes.
Are you suggesting that the West takes carte blanche towards ecological destruction? Are you suggesting that we just turn a blind eye to it?
What we are saying here is that we have the possibility here to be talking about the environment. They don't necessarily have that kind of luxury if they can't eat. Basically, we are staying in a situation here where we are imposing our values over countries that have the sovereign right of deciding themselves what kind of values they want to enforce. And if we want them to change them, then we should discuss with them and find a compromise with them, and maybe also change our point of view and our standards according to their needs, that is the right way of doing it. We cannot go imposing it by playing on the economical level. On the other hand, we are also risking bankrupting not only the multinational companies, but also all the countries that these companies are working in, and eventually, and in a second phase, once this crisis is over, we are also risking actually to lose our edge on clean technologies and on expensive technologies that right now are not competitive enough. Thank you very much.
We thank the previous speaker very much, and are happy to call upon the Deputy Prime Minister, Nicolas.
I didn't see it.
Speak from here.
Before I'm going to speak a little bit about the Rezny National Park in Ecuador and the extractive businesses, multinational corporations, well, execute there and somewhere else as well. Let me say a few words to my previous. First of all, we do not buy the point at all that our clean tech, high-tech, clean tech development would have a setback, because logically thinking, if we impose our high-level environmental protection standards in third world and emerging countries, we think that the market grows, and as we are market leaders in high-tech, clean technology, we will probably sell a lot. So this is actually something that's beneficial to us. Also, you said we are putting an advantage on our people at the expense of people there, meaning in emerging countries or so-called third world countries. I don't believe that. From a logical perspective, the wages over there in emerging countries as well as in third world countries will still be much, much lower, so they will still have the benefit of lower labor cost, and multinational corporations will still be inclined to produce there. But now they will adhere to our high standards in anti-pollution law and in environmental protection, and we believe that is beneficial to not only to us, it is to us because the world is a global world, and unfortunately wind will bring the pollution from wherever it is to us. There's no question there. The world is one living organism, and if you pollute the environment in the Congo, it will be at the expenses of all the people on the planet. And also, we will help the people there immediately, because they will not be faced in their day-to-day life with the actual spillover, negative spillover effects on their lives there due to the low environmental standards of production. For example, let's look at the Rezny National Park in Ecuador, which is called the lung of the world, because there's rainforest that is it's the most biodiverse area in the whole world. There, on each hectare there's more different fauna and flora than in the whole Northern American continent taken together. And that is the lung of our world. We can breathe because this rainforest is protected, and so we have a very own interest to protect that further. And extractive companies there, because they have very rich oil reserves, very rich heavy soil and rare metals there, extractive companies there obviously want to extract things, and these things, the resources they extract, will obviously be used for a production chain in order to, for example, build high-tech components we then use here in the Western countries. And we believe that is our duty, because it's actually all this, the production, the revenue from the production, and the high-tech in this building, for example, is something that benefits us directly, so we are responsible for protecting the environment there, because that is beneficial to us, and it's beneficial to them, because the people do not have to live in toxic waste there anymore. And we believe that is a plus, a benefit for all parties involved. I have shown you three. Okay. Okay, and then you said we need to respect their democratic standards. Truly, we would have to. But as far as I know, the Republic of Congo does not have our high democratic standards. And why? Because the people there are not empowered yet. With our model, people there will likely be more empowered because they will see that others actually care not only about the environment in general, but also about their immediate living conditions, and they will probably feel more inclined to actually try and go to the streets and take over actual democratic values, try to build up, try to stand up for their rights, and they will probably be more successful than they are right now, where corrupt governments often try to get get personal wealth out of the dealings of multinational, transnational corporations in emerging countries. We think we have an indirect positive effect on human rights development in emerging countries as well as in third world countries. We think that if looking at different perspectives, if I'm looking at the people here, we will not get in the status quo, we do not get effective environmental protection, although we want that. So, as my previous speech, my teammate already said, in fact, we are strengthening democracy here. We actually give the people here their will, an effective environmental protection. We cannot have that if we allow multinational corporations to pollute the environment somewhere else, for example in the Congo, because this will definitely fall back on us. And also, that is something that is damage caused to our very democracy, because the people will not effectively get that what they want. Still, we will tell them all the time in Western countries, yes, of course, we are all protecting the environment. Look, if you want to produce here, over there in Vienna, you have to adhere to very strict environmental protection standards. But that is de facto a lie. Because of course we know no one is producing textiles, for example, here in Vienna. Very few textiles are produced here in Vienna. But in Bangladesh, for example, textiles are produced all the time. They use very toxic bleaching, they use very toxic coloring materials. And that is something that actually goes exactly against the will of our population here, and most definitely against the will of the population there. Please.
Can't our population in that case choose other products that are more environmentally friendly? We still have that choice.
Of course, in theory you could, but in practice there's two problems with that. First of all, there's no real offer, and second of all, people do not choose it, and the worst problem there is you do not actually know whether this chair, which looks quite environment friendly, whether this chair actually is in its production chain has very hard problems with environmental protection. You cannot tell because you do not know where the components are from, because multinational corporations selling this chair here in Vienna, they can do whatever they want abroad, and they will because it's competition. That's my last point. We actually protect with our model. We protect these companies who do want to produce in a less harmful way, who want to protect the environment. We do protect these multinational corporations at the expense of those multinational corporations who right now in the status quo are abusing the very limited reach of our environmental protection law and go to Bangladesh and produce cheap things or extract oil somewhere cheap from the rainforest and then sell this very chair here in Vienna. We think we should protect the right mindset in multinational companies. And that right mindset is environmental protection for everyone, because as I have shown you, everyone benefits. And this is why today I'm proud to propose.
Cool. We thank the previous speaker very much and are happy to call upon Leo, the Deputy Leader of Opposition.
Thank you very much. So I'm going to talk about how taking control, forcing people and organizations to do these decisions, certain kind of decisions that they have are going to lead them to react in ways that are counterproductive for all parties, actually. So what I'm going to talk about is first how how this takes control away and choice away from almost everyone involved. Second, how countries always want to compete, and so they will find other ways to compete. And third, I'm going to talk about how citizens in the Western states are going to be taking some choice away from them as well. So first, let's quickly, the government is talking about how, in the previous speech, how people in developing countries can live in a clean environment after this policy. So the question here is not whether they would get some benefit of, say, a cleaner environment, maybe some marginal benefit from that, but what we talk about here is that marginal benefit versus what the cost is. It's not only benefit, it's benefit versus cost, and what we're going to argue here is that the cost is going to be much higher. So there are side effects that outweigh the little benefit that might be. So first of all, behind the side effects that this is going to have is that this takes away control and choice from almost everyone. So here, what happens is that, first of all, businesses. So you enforce these standards to businesses, and they have to obey them. They have no choice because their customers are in the Western countries. The motion says if you do any business in Western states, then you have to have these standards. So obviously the companies have no choice but to follow them because their customers are in the Western states, and if they are to do business there, no thank you, they have to follow the standards. So you're forcing the company's hand. No thank you. So what this leads to, secondly, is that the developing countries then, their hand is forced because, okay, the companies have to have the standards, so the developing country has to have the standard as well if they want the company to be there. Now, what they also want to have is a competitive advantage. They want to give the company some sort of environment that the company wants to come there. So they have to do something else to still have the competitive advantage. They have to, say, lower their wages even more. Like the government says, they have low wages, but if they can't compete on environmental standards, then they're going to compete by lowering wages, for example, which is going to be not very nice.
On that point, sir?
Nothing. And third, who this robs choice from is the citizens in the Western countries. Now, this is actually assuming that people would want to have environmental standards enforced rather than have, say, cheap stuff, like iPhones and so forth. And it's also assuming, in an alternative scenario, that people would want to enforce environmental standards more than, say, labor standards, because this is the alternative competitive edge that the countries can adopt. So what this motion does is actually take choice away from everyone except the Western government, who in their theories thinks that this is a good thing. Yes?
Okay, there are some regions in the world where environmental standards either don't exist or can't be implemented by the government. Wouldn't it help if companies start to implement environmental standards in these countries for themselves and for us?
Well, that's what I'm coming to. That what will happen when they will have to do that. You're forcing the companies to implement those standards. It's exactly the problem, because that will lead to exactly my second point, is that countries always want to compete, so they will find other ways. Now, exactly, if you have a company who goes into Congo, or what was your example, and if they can't use low environmental standards as a competitive advantage, they're going to lower the wages, they're going to make the worker conditions worse, they're going to do something else to have the company come there. And you can't, no thank you. And it's not like exactly you can start imposing standards on everything, because then what you would create, no thank you, is a situation where you have essentially imposing standards, say, on worker conditions, salary, environmental standards. Ultimately, you would lead to a situation where only the Western states could actually comply to those standards, and then you're robbing the developing countries of all kinds of competitive advantage, and that's probably not very good for them. No, thank you. So what will happen here is, when you enforce especially environmental standards, is that they will find other ways to compete, which is by worsening the worker conditions, which is kind of, not a good thing, at least we believe so.
On a point
So, second, the point here is also that citizens in the Western states, this is sort of deciding for them as well. Because obviously, yes, we have democracy here. Democracy means that people want something, they choose people into power, and they, who are going to do whatever the people's favorable decision is. Now the thing here is that yes, people want good environment. Like you said, people say, okay, we want good environmental standards and all that stuff, but they also want their cheap iPhones. So it's very easy to say that, okay, we want these environmental standards, but as long as it doesn't really affect the price of our iPhones. So here, when you're imposing these standards, you're sort of robbing away from the democratic process which normally would work, that people would actually, if they really wanted the environmental standards more than the iPhones and more than the labor standards, for example, they would choose, no thank you, people to power who are going to run this. And the current situation isn't that. The current situation is that people do favor environment. There are positive directions. People buy more safe, fair trade products and so forth, but it is not a mainstream thing. It's not the situation where people actually want that more than the alternatives. No, thank you. So it sounds nice to say that you're, you know, carrying this flag of environmental protection, which people actually in the Western states want, but it is not really what they want, because otherwise it would be going that direction naturally. And by them, for example, favoring more and more the companies who provide these environmental standards already. That would be a more stronger signal for people actually wanting this, rather than they're buying the phones that are somewhat cheaper. So the point here is that you are enforcing the hand of the companies because their customers are in the Western states. Then the countries have to adapt and do whatever they can to compete, which can lead to lowering wages, lowering standards, and so forth. And you're also disrupting the democratic process by making the decision for the people, because, you know, environmental protection sounds good, but the fact is that people actually have conflicting wants and needs, and in the world currently, they don't want environmental standards that much that they would, you know, take it over cheap stuff. So by having this Western state hubris, you're actually resulting in a situation where almost no one benefits. Thank you.
We'd like to thank the Deputy Leader of Opposition and indeed the entire first half, and call upon the Member of Government, Rory, to start the case for the second proposition.
Thank you. So firstly, I'd like to rebuttal this notion that somehow wanting cheap iPhones is related to democracy. The basic economic laws of demand always stipulate that the lower the cost, the more demand there's going to be. Of course, I would absolutely bloody love a free iPhone, but that doesn't mean that I can have one. That's not how democracy works. Secondly, I want to talk about this matter of autonomy that's come up a lot in this first half. And frankly, we on the proposition think that it's nonsense. Okay, so it's not going to lead to a further fall in wages, because ultimately, where else are contractors in Western countries going to go? Because the fact of the matter is, wherever they look, those companies which they reach out to are still going to have to comply with Western laws. So what we are left with is a situation in which they either have to pay Western wages or the relative parity of developing nations' wages, which are clearly going to be lower due to cost of living issues, due to foreign exchange issues. I think we can all agree on that. So ultimately, it's still going to be cheaper for them to reach out to developing nations. Therefore, we do not think that developing nations are going to suffer negatively from this. Secondly, we would like to point out that multinational companies still will have a choice as to who they want to go to. If they want to deal solely within their own domestic realm, then they can deal solely within their own domestic ecological environmental laws. So they are still maintaining their autonomy there. This is not some sort of post-colonial notion or anything like that. We are still maintaining autonomy for all parties. And on that note, I'd like to go on to the stakeholders, and I'm going to discuss three stakeholders. I'm going to discuss the developing nations, the Western states, and the companies. And we truly believe that it benefits all three people, all three stakeholders in this. Let's consider that global warming is a matter that affects the whole globe, hence it is global warming. It's not national warming. It doesn't affect just the West. And moreover, in actual fact, it affects developing nations much more. Because we look at developing nations and we see, where is their main GDP coming from? Well, it's coming from natural resources. This is the main source of income for most developing nations. And therefore, if we ruin the world, what is going to be left for developing nations? It's all very well for us Western nations to ruin the world, because we're largely based on services or manufacturing, relatively advanced technological manufacturing. Look at our neighbours in Germany, they're manufacturing cars. In London, we're doing financial services. But in these developing nations, they're relying hugely on mining, on drilling, etc., etc. So actually, we think it's going to improve their economy if we're able to improve the sustenance of their land. So that's why we feel it benefits them. But moreover, it's going to be giving them a very good name. If they're following Western standards of ecological environment, Now, it is, whether for good or for bad, it's true that Western democracy largely has perhaps the highest plinth on the international stage. It's going to really put them up there because it's going to be setting a standard. It's going to be giving them more authority. It's going to be giving them a name, like the Maldives, who for a long time have been promoting environmental issues, and it's given them more authority on the world stage. That's how it's going to benefit them as well. Yes?
Once again, we are forcing our models on these people that don't necessarily want it.
Thank you. Like I've already explained these matters of autonomy. I've already explained multinational companies. I've already explained how Western countries are still going to reach out to them. So we don't feel that that's actually a relevant issue at all. Secondly, it's going to be mutual respect. It's going to be mutual respect between the two parties. It's going to stop the Western countries from taking advantage and just reaping all the natural resources from the developing nations. And we think this is surely a good thing. So secondly, I'd like to talk about Western nations and how it helps them. Well, it prevents an unfair advantage that puts the advantage on the party who most destroys the environment. The opposition today have almost been speaking about environmental climate change as if it's not a big problem in this world. They've almost been saying, well, yes, I mean, look, there's going to be some climate change, but look at the wages, look at the autonomy. Well, I've already disproved the autonomy and the wages point, so I thought it was irrelevant, but I'd like to back up this point about environment. So surely it is better that all countries, all companies should work to the same environmental standards. What that does is it leaves you with a fair and straight playing field for all companies to work to. We also believe that it improves the Western countries, the Western states' qualities of the products and gives them better and more fair and more mutually respective trading deals. So third stakeholder are companies. So why would a company want to do this? And I mean, yes, it may increase the cost of production slightly, but yet why then, I would argue, or I would ask of you, is it that so many Western companies are going out there and they're saying, we're going to implement a green policy, we're going to stop using this material, we're going to make sure that we use great green technology. We look at Apple, we look at Tesla, we look at Google. All these companies have green pledges, and that's for a very good reason, but they're forward-looking. They're looking towards the future. They realise that this is going to be the way in which they have to behave. They also realise it's bloody good public relations. I mean, let's not lie about that. And that's not a bad thing. If it improves their image, and it improves the quality of living for those in the third world, those who are much closer to nature, those who are perhaps living on the ground, perhaps even in slums in certain countries, it matters to them a great deal about the quality of their water. They have to go get it out of the river every morning. It's all very well for us just to disregard this, opening up the taps from this beautiful Viennese glacier water. Yet these people are drinking out of the rivers. They're living next to the land. Yet we, as Marx so famously noted, are so departed from our ancestral heritage of living in the land that it's perhaps too easy for us to disregard it. So we do not feel this is a Western-centric notion. We do not feel that we're imposing Western standards. Moreover, we feel we are facilitating what developing nations truly want, and that is a healthy environment in which they can reap the economic gains of. Yes?
Don't you think the people in developing countries want to eat and have it yeah.
I understand. So, do people in developing countries? Well, yes, of course they do. And I've just proven to you, and you've not been able to disprove this, how they're not going to be able to eat. Look, it's still going to be cheaper for Western contractors to outsource to these countries. Therefore, we're still going to employ them. They're not going to have any other choice, because ultimately they have to conform to their own domestic standards. Moreover, we're going to be helping the Western countries eat by improving the environmental standards of their countries. That means they'll be able to have more agricultural growth there. They'll be able to have more domestic agriculture. That's going to bring down the cost of food in their countries, because they'll actually be able to grow soil, grow food from their land for the first time in years, because they won't be having droughts, because they'll actually be having environmental standards in place, rather than just reckless, irresponsible sustainability. I'd just like to finish on a very interesting analogy that the Economic Foundation came up with. Basically, a baby hamster doubles each day up until puberty. Now, if you left a baby hamster to grow for 1 year, you'd be staring at a 1 billion ton hamster. And that is the current model which is being imposed by developing nations, being imposed by the West and by our reckless demand. A 1 billion ton hamster could eat an entire world supply of corn in one sitting. And what we want to do is we want to live with a much more level playing field, a much more sustainable environment, and a much better economic landscape. Thank you.
We thank the previous speaker very much and are happy to call upon the member of opposition, Vanessa. No, sorry. Edge.
Thank you. Firstly, it would be great if environmental policies would be implied overnight as they suppose or propose. But now I will tell you how this implementation is not sustainable and will harm the environmental policies much more than it does right now. And I will have some rebuttals and I will talk about three parties, Western states and Western states citizens, how they are going to be affected from this policy, third world states and multinational corporations. They all, in fact, affect the citizens of Western countries, citizens, our citizens, and it will bring us to a worse situation than today's. First of all, yes, the cost of production in third world states is still going to be cheaper, but when you push them to imply our environmental policies, it is in fact gonna raise our cost of their cost of production, and it is gonna raise the prices, and it is gonna reduce the purchasing power of your citizens, because right now, as they stated, yes, Apple and Google and others may imply green policies, and they may want to do that, but still our citizens have other choices, like other alternatives to them. If they cannot afford to buy an iPhone, they can afford another, they can afford a Samsung and they can go for it. But when you imply this policy, they cannot afford even a Samsung, and they cannot enjoy their previous no, thank you, not right now. Today we can imply environmental policies in our country, but we are not affected from the production stage times, and yes. For example, in China, yes, they have cheaper labor, but when we push them to imply our environmental policies, it's not still the cost of still the cost of a product is going to be higher in Western countries, and still our citizens will suffer the rise in prices. No, thank you. And when we come to multinational corporations, when they lose most of their profits, even if they can still produce in cheaper way in China, they still lose some of their profits, and they will have less on hand to invest, and they will go to recession with when they go to recession, the whole world will be affected from that, and there will be less investment, and again our citizens will suffer from that, and economically it is not going to be sustainable, and it will have worse effects. So this will lead us to the unsustainability of this policy. Before starting that, yes.
Now, even if everything you said would be perfectly true, which I personally don't believe, we on our side don't believe, wouldn't it be still much more important to protect the environment effectively for the future generations, because then you won't have the problem that in 20 years no one can afford a Samsung, but no one can afford to buy drinking water.
Yes, but I say that today we still have environmental policies. Today we don't let all the corporations or all the countries do what they want. Still today we have environmental development on process, and we argue that the environmental change is not going to be overnight. We still on process, and we still we go step by step. No, thank you. We go step by step. We argue with other countries to put some criteria on the production, put some criteria on agriculture, to everything. But we today have Kyoto Protocol to manage all the environmental issues. But it's not happening overnight. We still on process. But no, thank you. And we also make subsidies to the corporations to develop their ecological, to make their production in ecological way, to lead them clean technology for creating new technologies to be widely in the future. We still support the environmental issues, but it is not going to be overnight. We are still on the process, and when we do it, when we try to do it in overnight, when we try to do it immediately, it is going to lead an economical harm, an economical recession, and we don't want to do that. We want to go step by step, and by doing so, it is going to be maybe a slower development, but still it is going to work. Thank you.
We thank the previous speaker very much and are happy to call upon the opposition, the government whip, Vanessa.
So I'm going to talk about the main point of clash in this debate, which I see has been largely one point, and then I'm going to talk about what came out of both sides and how we kind of compared. So what I see from the main point of clash of the debate so far has been, on one side, on the opposition side, they're arguing the point of clash is whether we should kind of prioritize the economic well-being of the West or whether we should prioritize the environmental well-being of the developing nations. So I'm just going to talk briefly about what came out of both sides. So we heard from opposition. The reason they oppose, they gave several reasons in the leader's speech. Firstly, they spoke about this idea of sovereignty and how we can't force our standards on developing nations, and how that is a wrong thing to do. I would like to point out that there's many situations where we do actually impose our standards on developing world. When we talk about things like human rights violations, when we see child marriage and things of that nature, the West is very much outspoken on matters such as these. So the idea of sovereignty is not a reason in itself to kind of automatically protest, as long as it's it's good intentioned and it's going to serve a broader good in that sense. And then we heard another thing as well about how essentially this is going to lead to a loss of jobs, because people are going to immigrate from developing worlds, from developing nations to the West. But like my partner pointed out, this is very unlikely to happen, because although these corporations are going to suffer minor losses in terms of having to pay extra money extracting resources and things of that nature, comparatively, they're still going to have cheaper labor in these developing world, so it's very unlikely that there will be a loss of jobs because they're still motivated by expending the least amount of money possible, and cheap labor will still be in the developing world for various reasons. No, thank you. And then we heard another thing that came out of the deputy leader's speech, which was this idea of that because they will lose their competitive advantage, it would mean for them in order for them to kind of like maintain that, it means that they're going to like resort to like really awful things like lowering wages and like treating the employees worse. We would argue the same point again, that this is unlikely to happen because the developing world will still have that comparative advantage that these multinational corporations have in terms of like the cheaper labor. So either way, the harm that they're talking about just simply doesn't exist. No, thank you. And they talked about, yes, and also an important thing to point out is in the long run, although they lose the competitive advantage in terms of like they can no longer kind of like exploit developing countries and like use up the resources to pollute their environment and then like go off to their own more healthy environment, economic environment. We think that in the long run, like it has already been pointed out by my partner, in the long run, it doesn't matter if they lose this competitive advantage, because in the long run, either way, either two things are going to happen. Firstly, the environment will be so polluted in the long run that they won't be able to use the resources they have in the first place or extract them, no thank you. And secondly, also another thing that could happen, that will happen in the long run if this pollution doesn't stop, is that people are simply going to be too sick to be able to work in the first place. They're either going to be too sick to work, or they're not going to be well enough to work at like the optimum levels that they were working before. Yes.
So the key thing that you're missing is that the developing countries are not competing against the Western countries, they're competing against each other, which is why they will lower the wages even more, because they have to have the edge against the other developing countries.
Thank you. We would say that no, it's not just against, we would argue that they're not just competing against other developing countries, they're also competing against the Western states. And also all that is kind of like, it's kind of like saying the Western like economic pocket is more important than like these developing people's like environment and like whether they can be healthy and whether their environments can be maintained. On our side of the house, we think that harm that causes the developing world, that's caused to these developing nations, just doesn't outweigh or isn't strong enough to isn't strong enough to kind of like ignore that fact. And then we heard finally from the last speaker in opposition, spoke about two things, a couple of things that already come up, but they kind of like highlighted how the West is going to experience higher prices, which kind of ties into your point of information already. Basically, the speaker spoke about how it's going to lead to a recession because it's going to be like increase in like cost of iPhones and like goods of that nature. But even if that is true, we're still willing to like forego, or we're still willing to like people to pay a little bit more money for their iPhone if the other side of that is that people aren't dying because of like unhealthy environments in the developing world. Like my partner pointed out, people aren't like unable to like drinking water from their environment because it's so polluted by these countries that come and exploit these developing world. And then we also heard about this idea of recession, that it's going to be such it's going to have such a negative effect that's going to lead to recession. We think that the harm that this would cause to like these multinational companies in terms of like profit just simply isn't going to be enough for them to like lead to a recession, because firstly, they're still going to be exploiting the cheap labor that is in the developing world anyway, so the loss are going to be very, very minimal. My partner Rory brought you many things. He spoke about, firstly, about the stakeholders, and he broke it down in terms of like the developing nations, and then talked about the West. Obviously, in the developing nations, the pros that he brought you are like kind of like the strongest arguments, I would say, in the debate, because he spoke about how in the long term it doesn't really matter, because they're going to either be too sick to kind of like work in the first place, so these multinational companies aren't going to have like these workers in anyway, but also in the long run there will be no resources for these multinational companies to exploit in the first place, because they'll all be like polluted to no end. And he spoke about how it affects the developing world more, because obviously the developing world more because obviously here in the West we have services and things like manufacturing, so we don't actually necessarily see all these harms. So we can kind of like be blind to it, and we think it's very detrimental. It sends a very detrimental message to the rest of the world. First of all, in terms of our image, that we're willing to kind of like benefit our pockets at the cost of like people's lives and also in the long-term livelihood. We think that the harm that we get, that they get on their side when they choose to put economic value over people's lives, in terms of like the image, how our image as the West is going to suffer and how our authority is going to kind of be weakened, is not worth the profits that they're going to lose. And then he talked about also this idea about, and also tied onto that was the idea of moral authority. So even from a very selfish point of view, our image is still improved as the West because we now have a moral high ground, because we're sending a message to the world saying we care about your environment more than we care about our pockets, even if it is superficial, which means that our image globally is strengthened. For all those reasons, very happy to propose.
We thank the previous speaker very much and are happy to call upon the opposition with Anil.
Okay, so here we are arguing as a last speaker. I will just sum up the match and talk about what we argued today, and we'll explain you why we believe, as my side, multinational when multinational corporations conduct any business investor states, these nations shouldn't enforce their environmental standards at all stages of production. Opening government started with we should change environmental issues beyond borders. Well, as my partner said, we also believe that we can do it, but we can only do it by time. But these changes cannot do it overnight, and she explained why this can't happen overnight, why this why these decisions is not quite sustainable. Why we can't do it? Well, okay, and also I will explain this at my point. And also, they said West countries have moral duty for other countries' citizens. Well, as my side, we believe that I don't believe that we do, but if we do a moral duty, because we are not promising them we will keep their like profits as our countries' politicians. We are not promising them I will just protect your values, but we ourselves promise our citizens that we will protect your values and we will protect your stuff. That's why this is not a valid argument as my side, as I believe. Well, now I will try to just be better explanation why, as my side and my friend explained, why this is not sustainable strategy to do it overnight, why we can do it like this with a decision. Because she also explained that, and I think you also agree that cheap Western states and multicultural corporations just produce cheap products and they just buy cheap products, and from like China. But if we just put it on the stage, rise of price, there will be some rises of prices. It's because they will take care much more for environmental issues, and that's why I think we just agree on this, and that's why our students will have less reduced purchasing power, and this is very important because we will have, as our citizens have recession. For example, I will buy 5 of something at before this stuff happened, but after that I will have 4 things instead of 5. And after some time, for example, people just go outside and protested, for example, why we are caring for this stuff so much. Okay, we still handled this stuff so far. There was okay for us. We just faced not many things so far. We just went okay. Although you may claim that for in the future it's very good stand, I might say, as my friend said, this is not sustainable, and try to explain. Your people will just go over and will say, why do we care so much for this? We can still handle this in the in the future, or for example, the governments that try to just handle this stuff will change, etc. So this will not be a sustainable stand, and as my friend explained, it will not work. We should do it slowly and slowly. So that's why we can just acquire a good, helpful thing that works for both our nature and both our citizens from all aspects.
Okay, so we can't change it overnight, because negotiations with the other countries in order to make them implement what we think is a useful policy on pollution takes time. And this is exactly, isn't it? This is exactly why we tackle the issue where we can, with multinational corporations, which essentially are Western multinational corporations that operate abroad. So we can regulate them. And isn't that what makes this genius?
Yeah, as I explained, and also my friend explained this, it will not be a sustainable step. You might still say that, okay, like after 50 years we will be affected from these uneconomical steps, but we are explaining why these will not just be sustainable, why you can't just go further at these enforcements, and this will not be helpful, and as Western states we should go just like we do now, slowly and etc., to have more sustainable things. Okay, at my speech I just talked about the main crash of the match. Can we do it, or should we do it, etc., and or wanted to just enforce our standpoint of why this process will not be a sustainable process, and why it will not work. This is a waste of time.